Okay, so you know how every single shift we see people of all ages?
Right.
Well, we're diving deep into lifespan development today. I mean,
Yeah.
we always talk about how important it is, but you've given me your EMT textbook and some lecture notes, so I'm really excited to get into how patients' age actually changes how we approach their care.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes beyond just saying, oh, kids are different. Like, even vital signs, which seem so basic, can be totally different depending on if we're looking at a newborn versus a 90-year-old.
Totally. Like I was reading the textbook, and it said a heart rate of 140 in an infant, probably fine.
Yeah,
But an adult,
you're hitting the sirens.
yeah, totally different situation.
Totally different. And it's not even just about recognizing what's normal. It's about understanding how all those physiological differences can actually impact our assessment and treatment decisions. Because what could be super minor in one age group could be life-threatening in another.
Yeah. Exactly. So let's start right at the beginning. Neonates and infants, birth to 1-year-old. Those first 12 months are a wild ride.
Well, it's incredible how much development happens in just that 1 year. Going from being totally dependent on mom for everything to having their own independent circulatory systems.
You-
It's a huge adjustment for those little bodies.
And that first breath.
Yeah.
The textbook mentioned that an infant's lungs, they've never been inflated. That first breath is a pretty big deal.
It's a huge deal. And it's a good reminder for us that their airways are just tiny and delicate. We have to be so careful with suctioning, positioning. Even a small blockage can become critical in a heartbeat.
The book said that they're mostly nose breathers, too. So, nasal congestion, it's way more serious than it is for us.
Oh, for sure.
And then there's the tongue.
Yeah, the tongue, it's proportionally larger.
Yeah. And they have those shorter, narrower airways.
Exactly.
So it's just set up for potential disaster.
It's definitely something we have to keep in mind with airway management. We can't just do what works on an adult, Hyperextension, hyperflexion, that can actually make an airway obstruction worse in infants.
And it's not just the airway. Their whole respiratory system is different. The textbook really stressed being careful with ventilation, too much pressure, and we could be looking at barotrauma. And we don't want to make things worse, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, even life-saving interventions have to be adjusted based on the developmental stage of the patient.
So we've talked about breathing, but what about those reflexes that babies have? Like when you touch their cheek and they turn their head.
Oh, the rooting reflex.
Yeah.
It's like they're hardwired for survival from day one.
It's so cute.
And then there's the sucking reflex. You touch their lips, they start sucking. Essential for feeding, but also tells us a lot about their nervous system.
And the fontanelles, those soft spots on their heads, they always seem so fragile.
They are fragile, but they have a really important job. They allow the baby's head to actually change shape during birth, which is essential for them to pass through the birth canal.
Oh, right.
But here's the thing. Those fontanelles can also tell us what's happening inside the baby's head. A sunken fontanelle could be dehydration, and then on the other hand, a bulging fontanelle could mean there's pressure inside the skull. So we need to know what to look for.
So those soft spots are like these little windows into what's happening in their nervous system.
Exactly.
So even though an infant's nervous system is still developing, they can do some pretty incredible things. Like in the textbook, it said by 2 months, they're tracking objects with their eyes. They can recognize faces. By 6 months, they're sitting upright. They even start babbling.
And by their first birthday, they're usually taking their first steps, maybe with a little help, and even responding to their name. It's really amazing.
That's a lot of progress in a year.
Yeah.
And we're just talking about the physical development.
Oh, right. And then there's the emotional and social development that's happening at the same time.
Exactly. I mean, they're going from these tiny little babies to little humans with personalities.
Absolutely.
And their own way of communicating, which, let's be honest, at this point is mostly crying.
Yeah, that's their way of telling us what they need, Hunger, pain, just a little cuddle. And the better we get at understanding those cues, the better we can care for them.
The textbook mentioned trust versus mistrust. And I was wondering if you could explain what that means. How does that play into our interactions with infants?
So it all comes down to, are the infant's needs being met by their caregivers consistently? Because when their needs are met, they learn to trust the world, right? But when that care is inconsistent, if it's unreliable, then they might develop a sense of mistrust, and that can make them, more scared, especially around strangers like us. So if we're dealing with a baby who's fussy, especially if they're clinging to their parent or caregiver,
Yeah.
we want to approach slowly, build some trust before we just scoop them up.
Right, like they need to know we're there to help.
Mm,
Okay, so that need for security, it kind of goes along with them becoming toddlers, right? 1 to 3 years old, they're more mobile, more independent,
totally. But they still need that sense of safety and predictability, you know?
which I thought was interesting because the textbook also mentioned that toddlers are starting to lose that passive immunity they got from their mom. So it's like they're venturing out, both physically and with their immune systems.
Yeah, it's like their world is opening up. And as they're exposed to more germs, they're building their own immunity. So all those sniffles and coughs, as much as we don't love them,
Right.
it actually shows their immune system is working.
Okay, time to learn how to deal with this myself.
Exactly. And speaking of learning, their brains are going through some major growth during this time. Remember how we talked about fine motor skills?
Like using their fingers to pick stuff up instead of that whole hand grab.
Exactly, like that pincer grasp, that's a big deal. It means
Yeah.
their brains are making those connections, their hand-eye coordination's getting better.
Which is exciting, but also
Yeah.
kind of scary for parents, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Toddlers get into everything.
Absolutely. And that drive to explore, to be independent, that's all part of what Erickson called the autonomy versus shame and doubt stage.
Right, the textbook mentioned that. What does that look like for a toddler?
So think about it. They're learning to walk, talk, feed themselves. All of that gives them this feeling of, I can do this,
Mm.
you know? But they're also still really dependent on their caregivers, which can cause some internal conflict.
So if their attempts at being independent are met with criticism,
Yeah.
it can make them doubt their ability.
Exactly. And that's where that shame and doubt come in, right? They might start to feel like they aren't good enough or can't do anything right.
Which is why that balance of encouraging them, but also supporting them
Mm.
is so important.
It's like walking a tightrope sometimes. But when they master new skills and feel confident, that sets the stage for good self-esteem later on.
And then comes preschool, 3 to 6 years old. It's like their language and social skills just explode.
They go from stringing a few words together to having full-on conversations, telling stories. They even start using language to negotiate.
Oh, yeah. I've seen my niece do it. Those puppy dog eyes are a powerful tool.
And their social world gets so much bigger during this time. More interaction with other kids, learning to share, sometimes taking turns, understanding rules.
Which, let's be real, is an ongoing process for most preschoolers.
It definitely is. But all of that playing together, it's not just about having fun. They're learning how to cooperate, empathize, control their emotions. It's huge.
It's like they're learning the rules of the game.
Exactly. And as they get better at that game, they feel like they belong, like they're part of something.
Yeah, so we've got all this social emotional development, but their brains are still growing too, right?
Oh, yeah. By 6 years old, their brain is almost 90% of its adult weight.
Wow. No wonder they're asking a million questions a minute.
And their thinking is getting more complex. They start to understand cause and effect.
So, like, less likely to stick a fork in an electrical outlet?
Hopefully. But it's still developing, so they're not always going to make the safest choices.
Makes sense. So, as EMTs with preschoolers, what's our main takeaway?
Well, because their communication skills are still developing, we might have to be a little more creative. Simple language, visual aids, even getting down on their level can make a huge difference.
And patience. Remember, they're still working on those emotional regulation skills.
For sure. Now let's talk about school-age kids. 6 to 12 years old, like sponges, soaking up information, testing boundaries.
And physically still growing like crazy.
An average of 4 pounds and 2.5 inches each year.
My metabolism could never.
But it's not just physical growth. Their brains are doing some major rewiring during this time, too.
Like how?
Well, the textbook said that brain activity in both hemispheres really increases, and their thinking becomes more complex, more logical.
So they're not just going with their gut anymore.
Right. They can grasp abstract concepts, connect different ideas, understand different points of view.
It's like their world is getting a whole lot bigger.
Exactly. And with that bigger worldview, the way they see rules and morality also starts to shift.
So they're not just blindly following rules.
No. They start to question why things are the way they are. The textbook called it conventional reasoning, realizing that rules usually exist for a reason, to be fair, keep people safe.
Makes sense.
Right. It's like they're developing a sense of social responsibility.
Yeah, totally.
And for some kids, they even develop what's called post-conventional reasoning,
Yeah.
where their sense of right and wrong goes beyond just the rules. It's about individual rights, justice, what's ethically right, even if it means going against what everyone else is doing.
Wow. That's pretty advanced.
It is. It shows you their moral compass is really developing, and they're starting to think for themselves about these really complex issues.
And all this is happening while they're navigating the social scene at school,
Uh,
which is like a whole other challenge in itself.
Oh, absolutely. Peer pressure is huge at this age, and their self-esteem can really be tied to how well they fit in.
So how do we, as EMTs, factor all of that in when we're treating a school-aged kid?
I think one of the biggest things is remembering they're old enough to understand simple explanations, but they might not always be able to tell us what's wrong or what they're afraid of. So we have
Mhm.
to really listen, ask open-ended questions, pay attention to their body language.
And reassure them they're doing great, especially if they need something like an IV or a splint.
Yes, a little praise goes a long way in helping them feel brave.
Okay, now we're getting into teenage territory.
Yeah.
12 to 18 years old adolescents.
Ah,
I'm having flashbacks here.
laughs. It's a time of such huge change, both physically and emotionally. Their bodies are changing, hormones are all over the place, and they're trying to figure out who they are in the world.
And their brains are still under construction, right?
Oh, yeah, big time. Like the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that handles planning, decision-making, impulse control, that doesn't finish developing until their mid-20s.
Okay, that explains a lot.
It really does. So it makes sense that they might make impulsive decisions or take risks. They don't always have the ability to think about the long-term consequences.
Right, and then on top of that, they've got social media, pressure to do well in school, figuring out their future.
It's a lot to deal with. And for some, that stress and pressure comes out in ways that might seem like just acting out, but it could actually be a sign of some underlying mental health issues.
So as EMTs, how do we approach a teenager who might be struggling, especially if they don't really want to talk about it?
I think the most important thing is to be non-judgmental. Create a space where they feel safe opening up. Let them know we're here to listen no matter what, that their feelings are valid, even if the way they acted wasn't the best.
And of course, if we think they're going to hurt themselves or someone else, we have to take that seriously and get them help.
100%. We're not just there to treat their physical health. We need to look at the whole picture, you know? And if they need help, connect them with the resources to get them there.
Now, adulthood, which the textbook kind of just lumps together from like 19 to 65.
It's a pretty long stage. But in terms of vital signs, they tend to level off within the normal adult ranges during that time.
So those big variations we see in kids, they're basically over.
For the most part, yeah.
Okay. So our approach can be more consistent.
Exactly. Now, there are some general trends within adulthood, but it's important to remember everyone ages differently.
Oh, for sure. Lifestyle, genetics, all of that plays a role.
Right. So let's start with early adulthood. 19 to 40, the textbook actually called this the prime of life.
Yeah, that tracks. They're usually in peak physical condition then, right?
Yeah, full of energy, focused on their careers, relationships, starting families.
But even in their prime, there can be health challenges.
Definitely. Stress is huge during this stage. Work, family, money, social obligations, it can really take a toll.
And a lot of unhealthy habits that can cause problems later on, like eating poorly, not exercising, smoking, they often start during this time.
That's true, but it's also a good time to promote healthy habits. Talk about preventative care. What they do now really impacts their future health.
So even on those calls that aren't life or death, we can still take those opportunities to encourage healthy choices.
Exactly. Then we hit middle adulthood, 40 to 65. That's when the more subtle signs of aging tend to show up.
What kind of signs are we talking about?
Well, their metabolism slows down, so it's easier to gain weight, harder to lose it. Their eyesight might change, their energy levels might not be what they used to be, they might start to have more aches and pains.
And for women, menopause is a big one during this time.
Yeah, definitely. Menopause is a natural part of life, but it can come with a lot of changes, both physically and emotionally.
Like the hot flashes, the mood swings.
Exactly. And it can be tough if they aren't prepared for it.
So we need to be aware of that, how much of an impact those hormonal changes can have.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also when we start to see more chronic health conditions, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis.
So those healthy habits we talked about before become even more important.
They really do. Catching and managing those conditions early on is key.
And finally, older adulthood, 65 and up.
Yeah.
Physical decline, but also I feel like this age group often has this incredible resilience.
They do. And it's the stage with the most variation, You could have an 80-year-old running marathons and a 65-year-old struggling with multiple health issues.
So we can't make assumptions based on age.
100%. Now, one of the biggest changes in older adulthood is a decline in what we call physiological reserve.
What does that mean exactly?
So it means their bodies aren't as good at bouncing back from illness or injury. Their organs might not work as well, their immune systems aren't as strong, which makes them more vulnerable to infections, complications.
So something like a cold could turn serious really quickly.
Exactly. Their bones also tend to become more brittle, so even a minor fall can lead to a fracture.
Which is why fall prevention is so important.
Absolutely. And on top of all that, they're more likely to be taking multiple medications. Right.
Which increases the risk of bad interactions.
So we need to be really careful when we're looking at their meds, make
Mm.
sure we're talking to their doctors and pharmacists.
For sure. And we can't forget about those cognitive changes that can happen as we age. A little memory loss is normal, but then there are things like dementia, Alzheimer's disease, which can really impact their thinking, their behavior, even their ability to communicate.
So patience is key if someone's confused or disoriented.
It all comes back to treating them with dignity and respect, just like we'd want for our own family.
Absolutely. This has been such a good deep dive. I can't believe how many things affect how we age and how those changes impact how we need to approach patient care at every stage.
It really puts things in perspective, and for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that age really is just a number. Every patient deserves compassion, understanding, and our best effort no matter what. Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What can you do in your own life to support healthy aging for yourself and those around you? How can you encourage that understanding and respect for people of all ages? Keep those questions in mind as you continue your amazing work as EMTs.
It is, and it's the stage where we see the most variation. You might have an 80-year-old who's still running marathons and then a 65-year-old who's struggling with a bunch of health problems.
So we can't make assumptions based on age.
Exactly. One of the biggest changes, though, in older adulthood is what we call a decline in physiological reserve.
What does that mean?
It means that their bodies just aren't as good at bouncing back from illness or injury. So their organs, their heart, lungs, they might not work as efficiently as they used to. Their immune system isn't as strong, so they're more susceptible to infections, complications.
So even something like a cold could turn serious pretty fast.
Exactly. And their bones, they tend to get more brittle, so even a minor fall can lead to a fracture.
Which is why fall prevention is so important.
So important. And then on top of all that, they're more likely to be on multiple medications.
Oh, right. Yes.
Which means higher risk of interactions, side effects.
So we have to be really careful when we're looking at their meds, make sure we're talking to their doctors and pharmacists.
Absolutely. We can't forget about the cognitive changes that can come with age, too.
Yeah.
Some memory loss is normal, but then you have things like dementia, Alzheimer's disease that can really affect their thinking, their behavior, even their ability to communicate.
Right.
So patience is key if they seem confused or disoriented.
Yeah, for sure.
It all comes down to treating them with dignity and respect, just like we'd want for, our own family members.
This has been awesome. I can't believe how many things play a role in how we age and how different each stage of life really is. Like it changes everything about how we need to approach patient care.
It really does put things into perspective. For me, the biggest takeaway is that age really is just a number, right? Every patient deserves our compassion, our understanding, and our best effort no matter what.
Love that. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What can you do in your own life to support healthy aging for yourself and those around you? How can we all encourage that understanding and respect for people of all ages? Keep those questions in mind as you continue your amazing work as EMTs.